Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on changing voting laws. On Tuesday, President Biden condemned recent efforts in 17 Republican-controlled states to pass laws changing when and where citizens can vote. Supporters say it's a response to allegations of voting fraud repeatedly made by former President Donald Trump in the months after his presidential defeat. However, opponents say the allegations are false and not substantiated by evidence, and the laws make it more difficult for marginalized communities to vote who already have a low voter turnout rate. Meanwhile, nearly a dozen Texas Democrats traveled to Washington, D.C. to pressure congressional lawmakers to enact new federal rules for conducting elections that would supersede any state actions. Tonight, we will hear arguments coming from both sides, but first, we want to dive into the nuts and bolts of this topic. Kicking off our conversation tonight is Devin Wiser. He is the executive director of the Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service at Weber State University. Devin, always nice to have you. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start our discussion with the precursor to these law changes. What can you tell us about the Supreme Court removing Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, and maybe you can explain what was pre-clearance?
Yes, absolutely. So this happened in 2013 in the Shelby case, and basically that the pre-clearance idea is that states with a history of voter discrimination would have to go to the federal government before they made any sort of changes to any voting laws. So all these changes that we're seeing these days would have had to be pre-approved by the federal government in the states that had that history. But it was struck down in 13 by the Supreme Court because they said that the formula that was used to determine which states were the states that had to jump through these hoops was outdated because it hadn't been updated in 40 years.
Okay, good to know a little bit of that context and background. Now we know that there are 17 Republican-controlled states that have or are attempting to change their voting laws. What are some commonalities between these states and maybe the commonalities between their legislative makeup?
Yeah, so it tends to be a lot of conservative states, states with Republican legislatures, especially if they have Republican legislatures and governors, and it makes it easier to get these laws passed. So that's the one side that's trying to tighten up these voting processes. On the other side, though, that you don't hear as much about is there are a number of states that are actually trying to loosen the ways that people can vote and sort of loosen the voting laws in their states as well.
Now, these voting laws consist of a number of changes. What are some of the big ones that stick out to you?
A lot of them have to do with mail-in voting. That's sort of a newer phenomenon, and it expanded greatly last year during the pandemic. So that's something that a lot of them deal with. A lot of them deal with where ballot boxes can be placed, how early voting can start in the process, because now, as we know, it's not just election day, but it's election weeks at the very least. So those are some of the big ones. There's also a few little provisions too, like can you provide food and drink to people standing in line to vote, things like that.
Now we'll dive into each side of this argument with our next two guests, but can you tell us a little bit about what we're hearing from both the supporting and opposing groups as far as their reasoning on this?
Absolutely. So the people that support enhanced voter sort of ID and things like that and more restrictions on voting, they want to ensure voter security. So they have a fear that there was not security and that sort of funny business happened, especially last year. There were many claims of that from President Trump and others. People on the other side, however, say, hey, it's not about security, it's about voter suppression. So those are the people that are more concerned about expanding the people who are allowed to vote, and they think these laws are absolutely beyond the pale and shouldn't be enacted.
Now, what is in H.R. 1, which is the For the People Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill?
So that is a bill that is going through Congress right now. It passed the House of Representatives. It's stalled so far in the Senate. As you know, it's a 50-50 split in the Senate right now, so they would need 10 Republicans to come over to pass legislation based on their rules that they have. But in that bill, basically it would federalize elections. They would mandate sort of a national voter registration, and they would mandate sort of when people can start early voting, and they would have a number of federal mandates, basically jumping into a territory that has historically always been controlled by states and local governments. So it would be a pretty massive expansion of federal power.
Now, Republicans argue that the federal government doesn't have a right to meddle in state elections. What are some of the nuances that exist when we're discussing states' rights and federal oversight?
Yeah, this is an argument that isn't just involved, it doesn't just have to do with voting laws, but it's sort of the struggle of the federal government versus the state governments. And that's sort of a classic struggle that has been in existence since the founding of our country. And that is a struggle that the founders put in on purpose. They didn't want one or the other to sort of expand their authority too much. And frankly, they didn't want to have the federal government overexpand. So it's sort of a more philosophical argument. And so conservatives on the side say, you know what, you're creeping into a place that has historically been with the states, so the federal government should just stay out.
This conversation over local control and federal oversight is just so interesting to me. Devin, where do you see this contentious subject going, or what do you think is going to happen in the near future?
Well, it will be interesting to watch H.R. 1 in Congress. I think it might have a hard time getting through the Senate right now. I don't think it has those 10 Republican supporters. And frankly, there are a few Democrats too that have expressed displeasure at sort of expanding the role of the federal government in elections that much, including Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Kristen Sinema from Arizona, and a few others. So I think that has a long road to hoe. On the state side, it will be interesting to watch these state legislatures as things progress. I don't see it slowing down necessarily. I think that there's still a clamor for more voter security in the red states, and there's a clamor for expanding voter access in the blue states. So I think that we're going to continue to see this discrepancy between the two types of states that we have in the United States of America.
A lot to watch for here. Thank you so much. You've been hearing from Devin Wiser, the Executive Director of the Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service at Weber State University. Devin, thank you so much for joining us tonight to help us break this down.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on changing voting laws. Now that we've gone over the nuts and bolts of this controversial legislation, we will hear more on the arguments for both sides. Joining us now are James Evans, the former chairman of the Utah Republican Party, and Nikki Venugopal, the director of campaigns at the ACLU of Utah. And thank you both so much for being here tonight. Let's start with proposed legislation in Texas. So it would give partisan poll watchers new access, protections, and power, ban the use of drop boxes for mail ballots, and tighten hours on early voting. So James, can we hear from you in making the case for these laws? And then Nikki, feel free to follow up with your thoughts.
Yes, well, usually when laws are being proposed, it's in response to things that they've come across. So for instance, many poll watchers were challenged in Democrat-controlled counties when they wanted to make sure that they can verify the voting that's been going on. But more than that, because more and more people are voting by mail, the ballot boxes we're used to seeing it's not behind that curtain, it's actually at people's kitchen tables. So we need to have a serious discussion, and Texas, I think, is leading the way. And who's going to be between the voter and their ballot? So in Texas, they're saying if you're going to participate in facilitating voting, helping people fill out their ballots, collecting the ballots to turn them in, that will become illegal, but you can assist as long as you clarify, as long as you disclose that it's yourself, that you're doing it. So what we have to ask ourselves is, could you imagine if you were casting your ballot the traditional way, and then someone is standing there helping you fill out your ballot? That's what's happening now at the kitchen table. So that opens itself up for all kinds of potential corruption. So beyond Texas, we really, as a nation, need to each state needs to have this discussion. How do we make sure that we make it easier to vote, but hard to cheat?
The way that I really think about this is in terms of what are our values as a democracy. And I believe that our democracy is foundational to the rest of the civil rights and liberties that we enjoy in this country. So I think we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about these proposed restrictions on that ability to vote, does that really align with the country that we want to be? Does that really make sense if what we want is free and fair elections? When we're doing things like cutting down early voting hours, restricting vote by mail, that just makes it harder to vote, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me if we're saying that we're supporting democracy. And so for those reasons, I think that this just goes way too far, especially having worked on the ground here in Utah in our elections. These are things that we know work for our democracy, things like vote by mail, things like early voting. Our elections officials in this overwhelmingly conservative state have verified that these methods of voting, these accessibilities, don't threaten, voter security. In fact, the data suggests that voter fraud is really not a concern in reality. We might think about these sort of nightmare scenarios, but they're not happening.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because this is the key point. Yes, I'm a big supporter of vote by mail, but what those Democrats in Texas are opposing is a way that you can have vote by mail. This idea that somehow they're restricting vote by mail isn't true. The COVID-19, they had expansive voting opportunities because of the fact that we could not be close together. Now Texas is saying we need to make this manageable so that we don't have fraud. I have personal experience as a candidate and as a former party chair where I witnessed voter fraud. My point to you, and I would say this to anyone that's listening, is that our foundational values are one where we want to make sure that people can vote, but people cannot cheat. Unfortunately, the left wants to ignore the cheating part and try to focus on saying that it's suppression, and that's unfortunate.
I think for me, this isn't really about left or right. Again, this is about, can we vote fairly and freely and easily? And who are we making it harder to vote for? Vote by mail has proven incredibly successful, especially, here in Utah, we can say that we're really proud to be leaders in vote by mail. And we don't have these restrictions that are being proposed in places like Texas, and our elections officials from the lieutenant governor's office on down to the county level have all verified that we've been trying this for many years now, and there's no issue. There's no instances of voter fraud that we're seeing. This just isn't happening. So to me, this is sort of a solution in search of a problem that we don't need. In fact, we need to be making voting more accessible.
James and Nikki, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break, but more to dive into. When we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on changing voting laws. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on changing voting laws. Before the break, we were joined by James Evans, the former chairman of the Utah Republican Party, and Nikki Venugopal, the director of campaigns at the ACLU of Utah. We pick up now right where we left off, and this time we will start with you, Nikki. What are your thoughts with what's going on with the legislature in Texas right now? We've got nearly a dozen Democratic lawmakers who traveled to D.C. in an attempt to convince Congress to pass federal rules to supersede any state decisions.
I think right now what we need to be asking ourselves is, why restrict the vote? What is the motivation there? I don't think we should be afraid of democracy. In fact, I think that is what our country is built upon, and the reason why we can enjoy civil rights and liberties. So, our partners on the ground in Texas who've been out there at every election, actually seeing how things like this have and will impact the people of Texas, have been really vocal opponents of this bill, because what they're seeing is that it's going to make voting harder. You're going to see people waiting in line for hours. And that doesn't sound like democracy to me. That doesn't sound like fair and equal access to our voting rights.
And James, go ahead, let's hear from you.
It's the way that I like to answer that is that if you look back at here in Utah, when we started vote by mail, we didn't start with a statewide effort. We started, and there were many discussions about how this was going to work. And we built up to it over a period of about 6 to 8 years. So to say that somehow Texas is supposed to go from 0 to 100, and if they don't, somehow they're trying to suppress the vote when they've been able to have vote successfully in their state for decades, it's disingenuous. And to say it's an all or nothing, if you don't do it the progressive way, then somehow you're racist or you're suppressing the vote. That to me is it dishonors the legitimate discussion that needs to be had. And the one that really gets under my skin is this belief that somehow if you have to have an ID, or you have to vote in person, or you have to show an ID for vote by mail, and if you're a minority, that somehow you're not capable of doing that. That to me is the ultimate and the soft bigotry of low expectations that George Bush always talked about when he talked about the racism on the left. Minorities can vote like anyone else, and to say that if a law is passed that somehow minorities cannot vote according to those rules, it's just, it really frustrates me. So this bill in Texas is simply making sure that those excesses because of COVID-19 are not going to stay in place. Let them have their discussions on how they want to expand vote by mail, and let them have their discussions on how they want to determine who can be involved in the collection of ballots and all of those sorts of things. But to say that there's voter suppression, to say that somehow people are afraid of voting, that framing of the argument is not going to get us anywhere.
James, I'm wondering, do you think voting laws in Utah should be different or the same as Texas?
Well, like I said, I'm a big supporter of vote by mail, but I remember when we first started, it took us 8 years to get here. And so I think once you start down that path and the controls are in place, states will become more relaxed about it, because then they know that their elections are going to have integrity. So allow them the opportunity to go through that process like we did here in Utah.
Nikki, let's hear from you. Do you think Utah should have similar voting laws as Texas is proposing?
No, not at all. I'll just come out and say that here in Utah, we've got a great system. In fact, we've been very proud that Utah's been a national leader. We implemented vote by mail before the pandemic, and many states looked to us in the last year and a half during COVID to see what their systems could look like. And I think we have a good model. I think it's interesting, to hear folks say they support the way we do things here in Utah, but also support these Texas voting bills, because the Texas laws are way more restrictive. And the way we set it up from day one here in Utah makes sense. It's accessible, it's convenient, and I think Texas could do that too from day one. I don't think we need to go way overboard right at the beginning and then somehow search for the right way later. I think that we could do it right here and now.
James and Nikki, we've got about 30 seconds left. I'm going to allow you to have final words. James, get out whatever you want to get out that you haven't yet in this conversation.
Yes, I like to say that Utah is not Texas and Texas is not Utah. So I respect each state and how they're finding their way with their state populations. I think that's what our founders envision our nation being, and not having an excessive federal overreach. So the games that the Democrats are playing around voting rights, creating these wedge issues, especially around race, are just disheartening, and I wish we could move beyond that and really talk about making sure that everyone is educated in the matters that they're voting on.
Nikki, final words from you?
I think when it comes to sort of this issue of, local control over voting rights, we're always going to be able to say, different counties can decide, which school, where do the polling places need to be to fit your community, and sort of changeable things like that on a local level. But I think what doesn't make a lot of sense is to say that in Texas, your voting rights need to be more restricted than in Utah. If we believe in the value of equal voting rights, again, going back to that idea of foundational democracy, then it shouldn't matter what state you live in. You should just be able to vote.
It was great to hear from the both of you. You've been hearing from James Evans, the former chairman of the Utah Republican Party, and Nikki Venugopal, the director of campaigns at the ACLU of Utah. Thank you both for being here tonight to provide your perspectives on the subject. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by going to facebook.com/group/ABC4 in Focus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.